Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about possession. Now, we're not talking about demons infesting your body, we're talking about controlling pawns in the world. So let's talk about how we can designate a pawn to be possessed. So we're back here in the editor, and we have several pawns in the world. Now, by default, none of these are designated to be possessed by a controller. That means we cannot control them. If we press play, we'll see that we have the ability to move around with the WASD keys. That's because we are controlling the default pawn. This is something built into the engine, and it will be there for us if we do not designate one of our pawns to be possessed. Now, the way to designate a pawn to be possessed is to select the pawn instance in the world, and in the details panel, search for a variable called AutoPossessPlayer. Now, AutoPossessPlayer by default is set to disabled, but if you click the drop-down, you'll see players 0 through 7. Now, these are not talking about multiple players in a networked multiplayer game. These would be multiple players on a single instance of the game, such as in a split-screen game where two people are playing on the same console or computer. So for our game, this will always be player 0. Now, what you do is you set this to player 0 for the pawn you would like to possess, and then when the game starts, that pawn will be the one possessed by player 0. And again, in our game, there is only one player, and that is player 0. So as a challenge, I'd like you to experiment with this possession thing. Set AutoPossessPlayer to player 0 on one of the turrets. See what happens. Press play and observe the results of setting this variable. Then try setting it on the tank. Now, you're going to need AutoPossessPlayer set to player 0 only on one of the pawns at a time. Otherwise, the engine doesn't know which one you mean to possess. So it's just going to pick one for you. So make sure AutoPossessPlayer is disabled on all pawns except for one at a time. Pause the video and experiment with possession now. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to try is I'm going to select one of the pawn turret instances and set its AutoPossessPlayer to player 0. Now, if I hit play, I'll see that I'm stuck to this turret, and of course I can't move around or anything because we haven't programmed any movement, and we're not even going to for the turret anyway. So this is not very exciting. It's actually kind of frustrating because we're stuck to this turret and we can't move around. We just see the tank sitting there. So I'm going to hit stop, and with that same pawn selected, I'm going to change this AutoPossessPlayer back to disabled. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is select our tank. Now, you may have noticed, as soon as you selected the tank in the world, we have a little pop-up window showing us the view from that tank's camera. Now, this is a nice built-in feature because it's showing us the view that we would have from this camera if we were possessing the pawn. And we can see that if we set AutoPossessPlayer to player 0 for the tank. Now, let's go ahead and hit play. And check it out. We see the view from the point of view of that camera. So that's pretty awesome. Now, again, we can click in the viewport and try to move around, but we have not handled any input. We're not changing its location with anything in the code. That's something that we have to implement ourselves. But the possession part, actually controlling the pawn, that we are now accomplishing. So in summary, we learned how we can possess a pawn, and that by setting its AutoPossessPlayer variable to player 0 is the way to do this. So now that we're possessing the pawn, it's time to control and move the pawn, and that we will cover in the lectures to come. Exciting stuff. I'll see you soon.